so much. I really appreciate it, you guys. It's great to be here, and sorry I missed Steve's talk last week, but last month. But this one will pretty much kind of pick up where you might have left off if you had a chance to hear, kind of talking about value, because there's a central theme about value tonight as well. So you can just kind of scroll as I talk, and we can kind of wing it. Yeah. Awesome, thank you. Some of you might not know who I am, and I appreciate being invited back again. It's always a delight coming here. And Pleasanton was such a pretty town. It was worth the drive just to see the nice lights. And so I have been spending my entire career working in using Agile and being Agile. I've had the good fortune of being in some very fast-paced industries. Started my career as a psychologist and then moved pretty quickly into criminal intelligence and worked for 6 years at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, which is like the Colorado's equivalent of FBI, and had an opportunity there to work with some really fast-paced artificial intelligence types forensic applications. And then was recruited by the Walt Disney Company to move out to California and develop some cutting-edge apps for the motion picture industry. And there, a lot of what we practice in Agile today kind of emerged out of the animation, feature animation, and motion picture production industry in the 60s and 70s. So again, motion picture production is very fast-paced, and I worked at Disney for 15 years before moving on to Universal Studios and supporting NBC and ABC as well, and then was recruited to move up here to come to work for Gap and help lead their Agile transformation, as well as help lead portfolio management, release management, PMOs, global PMOs, and that kind of work for the Gap, including kind of implementing DevOps and continuous delivery there. So since then, I left Gap about 4 years ago for my own company, and as Michael knows, I've been traveling, spending more of my time this year outside of the States, in fact in the Southern Hemisphere. Just recently got back from a trip to Brazil and several months in Australia, where I spend most of my time now, kind of helping businesses transform to agility. So a lot of what I'll be sharing with you tonight is work that I do with different industries, helping introduce business agility and helping introduce adaptive leadership. Hi.
Oh, sorry, Mike.
No worries, I just got here myself. I don't feel so bad now. Welcome. Did we want to do introductions around, or are we cool? Do you guys all know each other?
No, we don't.
Ah, okay, yeah, it'd be nice. Cool, if you don't mind. You want to start?
Yes. Hi, I'm Shubhashish. I work as a Scrum Master in Visa, the credit card company.
Ah, cool. Nice to meet you.
I am Steve Bachman, Agile trainer and coach. That's about it.
I'm Mike, I do the marketing and QA source.
Hi, I'm Preeti, working as a QA.
Cool.
My name is My name is Reza, I own a chain of gas station.
Ah, cool.
I'm Steven, I'm a programmer.
Nice to meet you.
Software.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm Bert, I'm a QA engineer.
cool. It's great to see you tonight. It's always cool when kindred spirits get together after hours, especially this time of year, because I know how precious everybody's time is. So let's make it a point to keep this really worthwhile for you. And in that spirit, do interrupt me when any topics come up, because I'll be going through at a pretty quick pace so that we can keep this highly interactive, and maybe introducing some new topics tonight, or hopefully some thought-provoking topics, kind of picking up where Stephen left off last week. So that's pretty much it about me. I have been on the Agile Alliance board for the last 4 years and helped introduce PMI to Agile, and have led the Agile PMI community of practice, which has about 40,000 members strong Agile PMs worldwide, and do a lot of work with Walmart and with some clients in South America and in Australia and New Zealand, Suncorp in particularly. But the cool part about the talk tonight and being here with you guys is there's really never been a more exciting time to be in doing the work that we're doing in terms of the disruptive change that's right on the horizon. So a lot of the topics that I'll be talking about tonight will be relative to that, you know, in terms of really being prepared to take advantage of the change to our competitive edge. And so we can keep moving.
Is your company's name iHurries?
My in a consulting company, my husband and I started our own company. It's iHorize, and it stands for Innovative Horizons.
Okay.
And we do primarily, well, we do a lot of QA training and QA work as well as, mostly now though, we spend more time with the business side of the house, of big companies, trying to adopt Agile. But I've spent a lot of my life in helping lead QA teams and dev teams as well. So that's
How
cool.
about the scrum process and all? Do you also help?
Yes, yes, most recently, probably the last time I've taught a Scrum-related class was to the GSA office in Chicago to a number of architects. That's not the IT architects, but building architects who are trying to understand how Scrum works in the federal government. You guys may know that the U.S. federal government has adopted Agile across the board for all of their IT projects, and they're primarily practicing Scrum. So there's a lot of learning that's going on for the government right now, and a lot of change and transition adopting Agile. So you can imagine how interesting it was with a number of building architects, construction architects.
That's interesting because we know that building and those kind of projects are all waterfall.
Well, traditionally,
Right.
right? But that's what's so exciting about this time. You know, now that we have advanced, if you will, to be the dominant methodology of choice in terms of IT software development, it's picking up and kind of extending to the whole business, including businesses that were non-traditionally, that would have been resistant to Agile, like the construction industry. In fact, there's been a lot of advancement, a lot of discussion too lately on Agile and Scrum for hardware engineering and hardware manufacturing. You know, actually developing the hardware side and the embedded system side. You know, so we've really now crossed the chasm, if you will, beyond just software development and moving into, you know, hardware and construction and beyond. You know, and where I spend most of my time now are helping business people adopt Agile, including like MDs, medical doctors and lawyers, and kind of across the board. So that the topic that I'm going to be talking about tonight is sort of universal beyond just IT Scrum and software Scrum. You know, and I'll be sharing with you some of the challenges that organizations face. You know, what do you imagine some of those might be in terms of really embracing agility and really kind of taking it to the next level? Any ideas on what some of the challenges might be? Mindset, absolutely, across the board mindset. And then leadership. You know, as you guys have probably experienced in your own worlds, sometimes managers have a hard time understanding how to create value when their traditional roles change. And they're trying then to help lead the organization to really be agile. You know, but that's the name of the game for the, you know, competitive, it's the only sustainable competitive edge that an organization has today, is business agility and embracing the same things that we've learned, you know, only extending it. And great answer on your part. The mindset is the hardest part, you know, and inevitably when we're under so much pressure, we will fall back to the fixed mindset. So we'll be talking about that a little bit tonight, and maybe sharing some ideas about how we can actually impact, how we can make that real.
Thinking about D&D and agility.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't seem to jive.
Yeah, for sure.
Do they really work with Agile now?
Absolutely. Imagine DOD and agility. That's
They vanish from
interesting.
the desk when they do Agile.
Yeah, exactly. It's really an interesting time. As in this slide we were talking about, really the entire federal government, the US federal government, the Canadian federal government, British government have all adopted Agile. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight is the CIO playbook for the US federal government. They've got one of the nicest, crispest, most effective playbooks out there. And those kind of can be used as a set of rules that can help navigate, you know, all the challenges. Imagine the Department of Defense, for example. We were talking about where some of the challenges are. Clearly the mindset, but also the traditional structures and infrastructures and systems, like contracts, you know, like, a lot of the processes that were organized around phased, staged gates have to be kind of rethought when you think about moving to agility, you know, and that requires first a mindset change and then a true adaptive approach to understanding how you need to change your behaviors and your systems to kind of increase the organization's ability to learn. Because at the heart of agility is learning, and the organization's ability to learn faster than the speed of change. Does that make sense? Cool.
And it's one of
yes.
the main focuses that they're looking at shooting for eliminating cost overruns.
For sure. You know, Steve, everyone is struggling with the fact that they have way more demand than their capacity. You know, and we all know the delusion, if you will, of effective estimating, you know, and predicting the unknown. Because in today's world, the unknown unknowns are what consistently trip us up. So traditional projects have inevitably just had severe cost overruns. And the assumptions were that the business partners, the customers, would try to create every conceivable requirement they could think of, you know, before they would actually let the teams get started. So you know what happens when, you know, you try to create this wish list that's extreme, you know, 50, 60, 70, 80 or more % of those features never deliver the real value. So not only are you struggling with the cost overruns, but the cost overruns and the technical debt that you're incurring are resulting from the fact that you're developing things that nobody really wanted in the first place. You know, they just included in their wish list because they felt that they didn't want to actually let anything go, right? Customers and the people who are actually articulating those wish lists are as busy as the rest of us, so they often don't take the time to think and really come up with an effective valuation technique or prioritization technique to really prioritize the work of the work, right? And so what we're going to be talking about tonight is really the only way to build a competitive edge in these times of extreme change and uncertainty that we're all facing today. And it's only going to get extremely more challenging, is to figure out what's really important, do less, and do only what's most important, learn continuously, because the value that we have to deliver to stay competitive in today's world, and especially in tomorrow's world, once the Internet of Things is really surrounding us, is going to be changing continuously. And value, again, is in the spirit or the mind of the customer. So we have to stay one step ahead of that and not necessarily even give them everything they ask for. To be order takers is not what's going to get us a competitive edge in the future. To be actually demand shapers, to help them really understand how to create value. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Does it make sense? Sound good? Cool. Anything in particular you want to make sure we focus on before I get started? Any questions, or you've already had some really good questions? Anything else that you want to make sure we zero in on?
So we will be talking about business values also?
Oh, very much so.
Or
Right.
work ethics and those kind of values too?
Well, those kind of come along with the package, if you will. But mostly, when I talk about value, I mean what creates value for the customer and what creates value for the business. Because at the same time we're talking about extreme change that we're going to be facing, that we're already facing, an interesting dynamic has also taken place, and that is historically businesses were organized around the assumption that they're going to deliver the best possible product, and the customer is going to just, be a side effect. But so the businesses were always focused more on profitability. Right now, for businesses to really stay competitive and to really be dominant in their industry, they have to focus on the customer experience first, and the profit will follow. So that's another mindset shift that's happening at the same time. And at the same time, we're recognizing that most of the management practices and most of the systems that we've implemented are way outdated. The management practices that most organizations, big companies like Visa, still embrace were about 100 years old, and they haven't changed significantly since then. So can you imagine, how these three kind of challenges need to be addressed, because there's a convergence of things that's creating this kind of havoc, and challenge. And you'll notice that at the same time, we're seeing extreme competition. Like, look at what's happening out there with Uber, let's say, and self-driving cars. I drove a Tesla over here tonight. Didn't help me much in the traffic, but technically Teslas can self-drive now. Maybe I should have let it do that tonight. But things are changing so radically in terms of disruptive competition. Hi, great to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. And I don't feel so bad that I'm not the latest person here. I'm seriously late. Cool. So in addition to everything else, there's disruptive innovation happening out there that's really surprising organizations that aren't building their competitive edge with business agility. Does that make sense? Companies that have been dominant in their industry for so long are no longer going to be dominant, when they are kind of blindsided, if you will, by the disruptive forces that are out there. So that's kind of what the topic of tonight is. How, regardless of what it is we each do, how we can start thinking about what our world is going to be like, let's say 5 years from now, the year 2020, and what those forces are going to be that are going to be compelling, creating a compelling case for disruptive change. Sound cool? Awesome. So we can go through these slides pretty quickly because I've covered some of the basics. If you don't mind just kind of almost scrolling, and I'll be good. So increasingly fast and disruptive change is what we've been talking about. It's really unpredictable. The business partners and our customers are more technologically savvy than ever before, even so much as us as IT professionals. The Internet of Things, machine intelligence, the emergence of smart 3D, wearable devices, changing everything. And there's surprising competitors everywhere. And convergence, everything is connected. The Internet of Everything is going to turn out to be much bigger than any of us really understand right now. And it requires us to deal with the unprecedented complexity, requires us to embrace agility of everything. So it's really all about agility, the way we think, the way we work, brand new ways of working, the way we organize our work, all needs to change. Questions, comments? Make sense?
Yeah,
Cool.
Is this giving us all ADD?
If we don't already have ADD, it's certainly going to give us ADD.
Things happen so quickly. And
Yeah.
things change so quickly. I think that, for example, if you look at the pace of TV shows and commercials now
Oh, yeah.
versus maybe 30 years ago,
Yeah,
I mean, we can't do that probably.
yeah.
Things back then now seem so slow.
Oh, totally. In fact, if you look at the pace of creating knowledge and us needing to keep up with new knowledge, unbelievably fast, exponentially so, more so than in the past. But here's an interesting kind of fact, and a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight involves the neuroscience of leadership as well as the neuroscience of learning. Kind of to amplify your point about the question of ADD, how long do you think our brains are actually capable of paying attention, focused attention? Any ideas? The human brain?
Couple of seconds.
Maximum of
5
15 minutes.
Oh, is it?
We can, right, 15, maybe 20.
Surely we all have ADD, maybe.
Yeah, maybe we even have ADD beyond that. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of variance between people.
Yeah, me too.
Well, there's,
Patience is gone too these days, right?
oh, totally.
Patience is
Well, and that's where I think you're getting back to, you know, the average leader, this is an interesting statistic. The average leader has about the attention, this is in an organization, a business leader, has about the attention span of a goldfish, 90 seconds, 90 seconds, in terms of the ADD effect, right? Because we've been so conditioned, and all of us have experienced that, right? We have been so conditioned to be distracted by every ping of every email, of whatever ping just distracted Michael. You know, I mean, we are distraction, we are interrupt focused, we are interrupt driven now. And so to your point about ADD, we actually almost thrive in that environment. But if we did want to really focus on a complex problem we wanted to solve, even then with an absolute intent focus and absolute discipline of not allowing ourselves to be disrupted by those pings, you know, 20 minutes max is the human brain's capacity to focus. Beyond that, it needs to rest. Focused learning, focused attention needs extreme energy. And that's something that we don't always pay attention to, because we just assume that our day, you know, we have unlimited capacity, 24 hours of the day, that we can learn or we can create or we can innovate, right? Not so. We actually have to be more disciplined and more guarded about how we invest our energy during the day because of that, and the interrupts. You know, so you guys have probably heard of the Pomodoro technique as one of the tools that we can add to our kind of Agile Leaders Toolkit, and that enables us or encourages us to stay focused and focus for 20-minute segments of time. There's a reason for that, because our brain, you know, needs a break after those 20 minutes of
The recent
focused.
study that you mentioned on the goldfish, there was
Yes.
a recent study on people using Facebook, Twitter, and all
Yes.
the other stuff for the middle school goers and the high school goers and the adults.
Yeah.
They said our span of attention is less than goldfish.
Yeah, it's getting worse. Exactly, right. Because of conditioning, right? This is behavioral conditioning. We have been conditioned to get the adrenaline rush, you know, of those interrupts, right? Because there is an adrenaline rush, you know, when there's a kind of the endorphins kind of reaction in your brain when you have this new novelty. That kind of brings us up to one of the topics we're getting to next, and that is, how do we actually create value for our customers? Because just as you were saying with the studies that are being done, neuroscience and the study of neuroscience now is actually delivering more knowledge than we've had throughout history, because the fMRI imaging and the ability to learn how the brain works is amplified well beyond original capabilities, where we had to actually dissect human brains to figure out really what was going on. You know, but now with functional MRI equipment, we're learning a great deal more about learning. We're learning a great deal more about leading, and we're changing at the same time. But just like those high school girls and those kids, you know, are actually kind of addicted, if you will, to the distraction, what about our customers? The interesting thing, and you can kind of, the interesting thing with our customers, you know, we have to create value and novelty, something new, something exciting, something really perceived as high value to the customers, and they're going through these same experiences. So the latest, a very recent study by Harvard Business Review has kind of helped us to understand that customers as well respond very positively to the novel, to the innovative, to the disruptive, right? They don't want the same old, you know, so you can't just rely on quality anymore. or reliability, to value in a sense is a commodity. So you have to continuously delight the customer. That's the key. You know how hard it is to just make the customer happy, but imagine having to delight a customer in the face of those extreme changes. That's what our future looks like.
That's not good at all.
Well, it actually depends on how you want to look at it.
I look at it as a flighty person,
Yeah,
and so that's not good in my world.
but here's an interesting
flaky.
thing. Flaky person. Well, that's where, I invite you to think about that as a opportunity to actually build a deeper relationship with the customers and give them what they need, not what they want.
Okay, I'm not gonna agree with you on that.
Okay, that's cool.
Okay, fine. I would say it's enabling someone with a bad habit. We'll leave it at that, how about that? Or you
yeah.
can put the last word in.
Okay, cool. But there is what I call now demand shaping, and that's it's a great point that you brought up, because bottom line, it elevates the importance of us not being order takers to flaky people, right? I mean, your point's a good one. If the customers, they're novelty, they're always going to want the new, the bright, the shiny, then we have to actually really make sure we don't become the order taker, and I think that was your real point. We don't want to become the order taker to a flaky customer. We need to help the customer understand what they need and not just what they want. And that really changes the game for us in terms of how do we earn the customer's trust. We have to understand what they need more than what they're asking for. You guys might know Richard Sheridan and the guys at Menlo Innovations. Richard's become quite famous with his book Joy Inc., and he's doing worldwide talks these days. But one of the things that Richard has done to the Menlo Innovations teams have done to kind of support your point is they've created a professional role for Agilists within their organizations, software engineers and QA engineers, to become high-tech anthropologists. And the role of that high-tech anthropologist is exactly what we're talking about right now. And that is to really observe and understand what the customer needs. And don't just go out and ask them what they want. Steve Jobs is fairly famous for this. Steve was disrespectful, if you will, of the customer's wants. And he really focused on what's going to really create that amazing delight in the customer, knowing that they are not going to ask for what they need, and nobody asked Apple to create the first iPod. They pretty much reinvented or created a whole new industry by practicing these deep empathy skills. And so one of the skills that we probably want to add to our personal toolkits for the future, kind of paying attention to what's going to give us a competitive edge, is just that, understanding empathy, understanding what the customer needs, and there's a lot of tools that we can add to our toolkits around that, like empathy maps, persona maps, customer journey maps, customer journey canvases. The cool thing about it is there's such an emergence of new tools out there that we can add to our personal our competitive toolkits, to stay ahead of what the changing demands are. But the customers are always going to be fickle, and they're always going to be very savvy. And to your earlier question, Steve, I think it was your question too, we're focusing tonight on the topic of not only customer value, but creating business value as well. Because if we aren't focused on profitability anymore for the organization, we have to ensure there's sufficient profitability to continue to delight the customer, right? And yet some of the highest value drivers that we're facing might be intangible. They might be brand loyalty. They might be brand awareness. They might be the social media, the buzz of what people are saying about your company. Might become as important as actual sales because they translate to future value. Just like you guys who are experts in quality know that technically in the Agile world, quality translates to future value. If you fail to invest in quality, you will not have a sustainable value proposition. We know that, in terms of technical debt, technical refactoring, the same holds true for customer delight. We have to kind of move away from being order takers and really being value creators and demand shapers. It's a word I use to reflect the fact that we have to understand what the customer needs and delight them continuously by giving them just that. And here's the really important point, and nothing more. This is where the talk kind of intersects with Steve's talk on value. We actually have to do less by giving the customer exactly what they need and nothing more. The same way as quality. We have to actually nail quality. And we do that by delivering real quality, but nothing more. No over-engineered, unnecessary testing. Discussions, topics, thoughts on that? Anything? Make sense?
It's like perfection versus excellence. Do what is
Exactly. Perfection is the enemy, right? Excellence is the goal, and continuous learning through empirical data, to really understand. Looking at metrics that matter now too. Metrics, just like everything else, if a metric is not creating real, tangible, measurable value, then we need to stop doing it. A lot of the processes that we spend a lot of our time working on are actually detrimental to real value, right? Metrics are one of the biggest. We fall into the trap. You nailed it earlier when you said the challenge is our own mindsets. We fall into the trap of thinking more is better. And we actually have to reverse that, just like the perfection versus excellence. We have to actually really believe that less is best, in terms of doing exactly what the customers need, no more, and then continue to delight them, because technology and competition is changing so fast that the only way to get ahead of that conundrum of the demand, far exceeding capacity, is to shift it and actually do only what creates the highest value with value curves, a lot of value tools, value engineering. We'll be talking about some ways to do that tonight.
What's the difference between excellence and perfection?
Excellent question.
But not perfect.
Yeah, but not a perfect question, and that's what made it such an excellent question, right? So there is a chart, and I can send that to Michael to post online for you guys, as well as the deck. But let's talk about it in terms of the essence of the answer. Excellence is doing exactly what matters and nothing more. Perfection is over-engineering. Perfection is adding more to this infinite quest of always getting better. So at the heart of perfectionism is the fact that we do really believe that if we just did a little bit more testing, if we just did a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, it would be better. Does that make sense? And yet we're never good enough, so we keep doing more, right? Where excellence kind of follows the agile principle of good enough for now, right? So when we start, let's say, with test-driven development, let's say we actually, from a practical example, we start with the test first. What do? We actually, the code fails until we keep running the test until the code passes. And then what? We stop testing. That's the difference between excellence and perfection. If we were perfectionists, we'd say, well, maybe we could add a little more robust test. Maybe we could test more. If we have so many tests, more tests have got to be better, right? We know that mindset, right? It's
the TDD and ADD, the automated test development as well. Like there's a place just to add an example there.
Yep.
So
How
just
many
enough.
hours?
Yeah.
Just enough.
How many hours of automation is an acceptable automation? Is it 2 days of continuous running of test cases to prove that your one increment that you had added is?
Or what if we add more? Couldn't more be better,
So if
right?
your automation could run within 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour, what's the maximum size of automation test suites? That's the other extreme where people automate everything and anything.
Yeah.
To check my recent increment, I need to run an automation script it for 4 hours to verify my last increment whether it worked.
which
Good
actually
enough.
creates waste,
Which actually
significant
creates
waste, and that's
So
the mindset,
do
the
not
perfection
automate
mindset.
everything.
Yeah. Exactly. You
What's
reach
the
a point
optimum
of
value?
diminishing returns, yes.
Well, there's your asymptotically approaching 100% whatever you get. And you're saying 100% is impossible or not really achievable. And somewhere, some magic number, whatever that number is good enough. And I would, as a counterexample, I would say fuzzy is a very good methodology, I don't want to use methodology, method to do testing.
Uh-huh.
And the more you do, the more you find with fuzzing.
Okay, so let's talk about that in terms of the perfect versus good enough for now. Right,
Sure,
if
run it
you
for an
start-
hour, you're gonna get probably 98% of the bugs
Yeah.
you're gonna find. And, well, if I'm running a hospital, that's not good enough for me.
Well, it's always, now that brings up an important point, which is situationally specific. If there's significant human life at risk, well then the parameters change, right? But
FDA
the
is going to
spirit,
govern that.
exactly,
Work in
this,
FDA, government organization myself.
exactly,
So you
this,
have
the spirit still holds true, right?
You still have 100% code coverage, you can still have 100% branch coverage, but you can't get 100% path coverage. And so therefore, you
Yeah.
can never achieve.
You can never achieve that 100%.
That's correct. So at some point, even for a white room testing,
Yeah.
you're going to have to say, it's close enough, hopefully it works fine.
That
Well,
scenario,
and
the possibility of
you-
that path of scenario to happen is 0.05.
Exactly.
Well, whatever the number is.
Right. But what's bringing up a really good point relative to a more technical application of these concepts, and that is one of the areas that I see missing a lot is the risk assessment side on the Scrum side, right? That's all too often we lose track from the perfection versus good enough for now spirit of just what is at risk here. If there's human life at risk, you're going to be focusing a lot more attention on alternate controls and alternate tests than you would, if you, and the flip side of that, I'm going to kind of go to the flip side so that we can have a balanced approach. All too often, organizations fall into the trap of fear-based controls, where you have lots of tests that are really not offsetting anything that's a significant risk to the company, and again, you're creating more waste or risk to the customer, right? I'm going to use an example that many of us may be familiar with, Sarbanes-Oxley controls, SOX controls. Companies have actually gone under as a result of over-engineered SOX controls, falling into the belief that, more is better. When the legislation was passed that indicated that, that created the demand for these SOX controls, which is that officers of organizations could be imprisoned for falsifying financial reporting, controls were put in to ensure that so that they didn't find themselves at risk for going into prison, and instead actually put the organizations, many, at risk of over-engineered controls. And a lot of times I will find that clients of mine, customers, actually are struggling in regulatory industries with the kind of explosion, if you will, of the kind of thinking, that says more is better in terms of regulatory controls. And you just keep adding more to that. Areas around PCI compliance and security today is just, a huge opportunity to really do focused risk assessment and risk-based controls, risk-based quality as opposed to fear-based quality, which falls into that mindset trap of more is better, right? So I hope that covered your question about what is the exact difference between perfection and excellence.
Well,
Yep.
one thing though, I also would say that in order to have a release of good enough,
Uh-huh.
I can not have a priority one bug.
Oh, definitely.
Well, the
Yeah.
priority two bug is, priority bug basically is a workaround, right?
Yeah.
Then that would maybe be good enough.
Absolutely, and that would be part of your definition of done and your user acceptance testing. So the spirit here is good enough for now doesn't mean, you know, poor quality. It means optimal quality. Does that make sense? That's the mindset change that we actually have to wrestle with in terms of really believing, you know, that quality is the goal. Quality is number one, and more is not better. Having it nailed is just perfect, because that frees us up to focus on future risks and innovation that's going to give us the competitive edge in this kind of an amplified, challenging future environment. Does that make sense? So the spirit here.
Quality and reliability.
Exactly, exactly like Jim Highsmith's Agile Triangle. Absolutely don't compromise on quality or real rigorous risk assessment, but do just enough, right? One time I had the opportunity to implement a TQM program for the Walt Disney Company and Walt Disney Studios, and that's a lesson I learned very quickly, you know, having gone into that particular assignment with the belief that more quality is always better, you know, having to learn. Actually, that's not the right way to think about it. The right amount of quality, you know, is ideal, right? Because you can't, you know, we all run the risk of over-engineering quality. That's the difference between perfection. We are driven, you know, and we have been conditioned through our educational systems, you know, that better, you know, we can always do better, right? We can always do more. We can always do better. And the spirit here is, yes, but that has to be kind of redefined in terms of how do we constitute value. So great conversation. And so one of the things we might want to think about is leveraging just what we know works really well for us in Agile QA with test-driven development. Apply that same logic to value test-driven funding, you know, in the portfolio, where you fund only initiatives that are preceded with the defined definition of done and the definition of test. Start with the test first, only test for value, and then run the experiments with benefits realization, right? If you were running a startup, if you were running your own company, that's certainly something you would do, right? You would start with a value test first. You know, we learned that from Eric Ries in the Lean Startup, right? You know, that's one way to actually ensure that we kind of guarantee excellence. Not shortcut excellence. Excellence is excellence, right? It's good enough for now. Some people jump to the conclusion when they hear good enough for now that it's sloppy. You know, it's like careless. It's kind of like reckless. It's like, but that's not the case. It's really...
Well, good enough for government work.
Yeah, exactly. And therein lies the real challenge with helping the government understand how to adopt agility.
Yeah.
You're going to be impressed with the material that I'll be sharing with you tonight on that. Cool. So great conversation, you guys are certainly awake and energized after our long commutes here. So really, the Internet of Things is going to be radically more impactful than we can even envision now. So it's really kind of an opportunity for us to sort of take stock now before we're going to be converged with the convergence of the technology enhancements and the tech savvy folks' wearable devices and driverless cars. You know, the Internet of Everything is going to be much bigger than any of us expected. A couple more slides on that. But our success really is embracing the kind of things that we've been talking about, including especially an agile leadership mindset. Effective leadership is actually critical in our future, and it's in extreme shortage right now because we haven't been training our leaders on how to be adaptive leaders and how to be effective agile leaders. We just assume they're going to figure it out along the way, most of us. Yes?
Values in a startup,
Mm-hmm.
bootstrapping it, and also how about the enterprise level?
Yes.
Because there is no shortage of funds, but people are not generating values. We are generating crappy stuff.
Yeah.
So on that level, what is your thoughts?
Yeah, let's think about it at the enterprise level, and let's look at some of the really big companies. Your company, I do most of my work with really, really big companies, Fortune 1 companies, big companies. You know, there is there is there is extreme demand over capacity, right? You know, I mean, that's the challenge, right? And the complexity that's inherent in very large companies, this logic, good enough for now, has to really being value-driven funding, has to be actually even more rigorously applied the larger the company, right? Because startups here in Silicon Valley do it by nature, right? They have to, right? And they all are fully engaged and they're all focused, razor-like value. I spoke at the product camp. If any of you guys have not know about the eBay product camp that's run, product agile camp that's run usually in May. Have you been to that one, Steve? It's a good thing to go to.
It's been a while.
I try to go whenever I'm home, when I'm home in the Bay Area, because it's a great way, even if you're not product owners or product managers, it's a great way for you to actually interact with some of the most innovative product managers in Silicon Valley, from the startups, entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs, and understand what's keeping them up at night and what's making them tick. So I'd strongly recommend that you put that on your to-do list for the spring. Pay attention, because once that opens up, it fills up like instantly, and they only let like 2,000 people attend. So if you do miss the opportunity to register for that, you can always sign up as a volunteer, and that'll give you an opportunity to actually at least experience it. It's run in a fairly open jam type environment. It's not a real open space, so I'm reluctant to say they call it an open space, but it's really an open jam, where all of you, anybody who comes to the event and registers, and it's completely free, and it's always hosted by eBay Google. You can present your topics, and then everyone who attends will vote on, because you can submit your topics on the boards, and then everybody who attends can vote. Well, last time I went, I did a talk on value, and I was particularly on these same topics, only under the value engineering kind of label, and I was particularly interested to hear what the entrepreneurs would think about the topic, because they're already extremely disciplined, and they were delighted with the topic. You know, I had stand-up crowd only, and I asked them, what was it that appealed to them about this particular topic, since they clearly are already masters of value, having run successful startups. You cannot run a successful startup if you don't have really good focus on value and eliminating all waste. If you're not really excellent at that excellence versus perfection, the startups are not going to thrive. And their answer to me, anybody want to guess what they answered? You know, what was the real compelling edge for the tools that I was offering them? You know, they said, even as brilliant startup entrepreneurs, even as serial entrepreneurs who are highly successful at creating companies, they are constantly distracted, just like you said at the beginning of the talk tonight, Steve, by that ping, bright light, cool thing. You know, there's always that distraction out there, that novelty that you were kind of talking about in terms of calling it flaky. There's always that flake effect, right, where you're going to be kind of distracted from that 20-minute focus that you can have as an entrepreneur, you know, on innovative thinking, and get pulled or distracted aside. And what they loved was the rigor of having a disciplined value model to actually really keep them centered on show me the value, right?
The formality of it?
Yes, they like the discipline of it, right? Because they know they need, as entrepreneurs, they have a bias towards innovation, let's say. Just like I said earlier, our customers have a bias for novelty. You know, so the entrepreneurs even have a bias for that new, bright, shiny, cool thing, right? And so the value and a rigorous value engineering discipline, without running the risk of going into the perfection mode or more is better, help them stay centered on optimizing their creation of value, which created successful startups for them. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
So I was really pleased to hear that was it was a highly valued tool. An enterprise value model and a value modeling tool was highly valued by the entrepreneurs as much as by the very, very large corporations. So would I advocate for everyone to really focus, and Steve did a talk on this last time you guys got together, really focus on quantifying what's important, really defining definitions of done, definitions of risk. Again, going back to your point about if human life is at risk, clearly, you know, there's more important focus on value models around that, but just enough to focus on what's really important and not over-engineered, right? By creating a value model, by creating value drivers. Intel's done the best job of any company I've seen out there. Published a number of books on this and have a value model that you can download and use for as a starting point. So you really want to focus on making value visible and making value-based decisions. So just as we start with test-driven development in the Agile QA world, you know, we start with value-driven development in the enterprise world. And we only fund, here's where I'm really getting serious about this, only fund initiatives, features, products, projects, whatever you want to call them, because I know there's a lot of talk about not really going for project-based funding anymore, but really a flow of optimal product-based funding. The spirit is don't fund anything that doesn't have a value-driven test associated with it with a hypothesis, you know, and replace all those really heavy, rigorous business cases, you know, where companies, the bigger the company, the bigger the business case, and the more effort that goes into that. What do you guys, from an agile mindset, how predictable or accurate do you think those rigorous business cases are? 50-50 at best. Yeah, at best, right? And if they don't actually associate benefits realization test with those rigorous business cases, then you've got zero learning, right? Then you just have propaganda, you know, in terms of exaggerated business cases, right? Because if you and I are competing for funding and we have limited funding, I guarantee you I'm going to put a more rigorous business case than you are, and then you're going to one-up me, and we're going to have spending all of our time dueling over powerful business cases with exaggerated benefits, which no one ever tests anyway, right? That is pure waste, you know. And the bigger the company, the more it has to actually offset that. So imagine if we replaced those business cases with hypotheses and had, we believe, a hypothesis language, just like we would the same language in the Scrum story card, you know, but we believe that if we were to fund a R&D effort or a test, you know, with the thinnest possible slice of this particular feature set or story, we believe that we would actually enhance the customer experience as measured by, and here's how we're going to test it. Imagine that replacing this big statistical, you know, 50-page business case that somebody spent $100,000 on or more, right? Which actually creates no value because exaggerations are actually rewarded over, you know, more rigorous scientific, you know, yeah, exactly.
At the end of the day or at the end of the project or initiative, they don't go back and measure.
Exactly.
They really achieve that.
Exactly. That's why. If you had the test first, let's say instead of having the business case, let's say this was the business case, right? You know, all these pages were representing. Imagine you have one simple test. Fund me this, and I will show you the results with the test. And even if we fail, we learn more. than if we didn't do it. We do the thinnest possible slice, and you do value-based funding, right? So I'm advocating that in an enterprise, a large enterprise, you would actually replace the PMOs and the portfolio teams with value delivery offices. Value, those professionals would be experts at understanding value and learning from value, right? Because if you start with the test first, imagine you start with the test first and then fund based on the highest value test probability, right? It's still an estimate. We all know estimates are at best, a guess, right? So we don't over-engineer it. What do we do instead? We thin slice it. We come up with the thinnest possible slice of that test, and then we learn with the benefits realization, right? Instead of not having any benefits because we've exhausted all the funding, because we've built all the features in that are not delivering most of the value. There's been a lot of research done. How many, even based on your own experience, how much of, as a developer or as an engineer or even as a scrum master, how many of the real features that you put in your project do you think really achieves the planned value to delight the customer?
20%.
It's good.
40%. And the medical device, exactly on the way that you said on
Yep.
the Siemens experience that I had.
Exactly.
Where we treat patients and the machines are so expensive. They have a lot of technology and techniques,
Yep.
treatment techniques. But if you see, depending upon the customer,
Yep.
they use the very default treatment.
Exactly.
Maximum utilization on that.
Bingo. Right.
That's the treatment that they use for cancer by default in all across the world.
90%,
90%
right.
of the time, that is the machine.
The one thing.
Depending on what
Exactly.
you give,
Right.
5 million or 10 million.
Exactly.
That is the treatment that is run forever. We gather that information
Exactly.
remotely and we show it to our business people, see that this is the same treatment run across all these different variants of machine.
Exactly.
80% proposition.
Yeah.
That's where the value is.
Exactly.
Not on your niche skills all the time.
It goes back to the 80-20 rule,
Yeah.
really. I mean, and in the absence of any real rigorous data, you can pretty much count on the likelihood that 80% of your stories are not going to, or features, or whatever we call them, are not going to deliver the expected value. And that 20% or less, like in that machine treatment, are going to be the workhorses. So the cool part of that story is, given the backdrop of the extreme challenges that are ahead of us, look at the cool opportunity we have to actually make sure we identify only those 10% that are going to create the highest value, knowing that technology is going to be accelerating and changing faster and faster, and think about this in terms of quality and technical debt and refactoring. We don't have to actually test and refactor that 80% of the code that actually is not delivering any measurable value. So that's why it's such a cool, exciting time to be in the industry today, right? So we just have to acknowledge with a mindset change that this is a new reality, and actually replace the goal of doing more or being a perfectionist with actually nailing the quality, nailing the excellence, and doing just enough, good enough for now, with thin slices of value-driven hypotheses to test, right? If you were running your own company, if you were an entrepreneur, that's how you'd be approaching it, right? You'd want to focus on those 10% of the features that delighted the customer, and you would deliver them in a fraction of the time, because those 80% of the features are going to be what's exploding and bloating the delivery and the release plans and the testing. All those features that we maintain then forever that are not ever really returning on the investment because we never did benefits realization. So you start first with the hypothesis, you do real benefits-driven funding, right? So you fund what's going to be most likely to deliver the benefits. And you make sure that you cultivate or you nurture innovation. So even if you can't quantify a specific dollar profit, you focus on future value of innovation, right? Where you carve that out too. That would become part of your value dials.
But question.
Yeah.
Of that 80% that will not delight the customers.
Yeah.
How we let it go?
Yeah, you never fund it in the first place. So here, let's take that. It's a great question. Let's take that and let's kind of amplify it in a pattern that I've seen happen in a lot of organizations that are just starting to embrace Scrum. Without the mindset change, without this belief, in what we're talking about here, what happens typically, we do fall into a pattern of more is better. And just like we said, okay, well, we're now going Agile. We're going to do Scrum, right? So instead of writing all these detailed requirements, we're going to start Catalyst for Conversation, and we're going to write stories. And we're going to write epic stories, and we're going to write, but guess what happens? We wind up with 500 stories, just like we had 500 requirements. Maybe we had 800 requirements, and we now drove them into 500 stories. What's wrong with that picture? It's the same pattern, right? 80% of those are not going to deliver any value, maybe even 90%. So you don't do them in the first place. You actually change the conversation. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier with demand shaping. You say, okay, instead of being order takers, and you say, okay, here's the epic. Here's the 10 epics that we want to do. You start right there, and you say, what's the one? What's the one that we want to do first that we can learn the most from? And obviously it's complex, in terms of some might be codependencies or whatever, but you zero in on the thin slice from the very beginning, and you decompose it down to only those features that are going to, the one or two features that are going to deliver on that epic story, right? You stop the story writing, and then all of the grooming of the story backlog and all the prioritizing and estimating of all these stories, and all these forced rank orders. I mean, we have 1,000 techniques to prioritize 1,000 stories. The key is to stop creating 1,000 stories.
So that's a leadership. That's a leadership change.
role, yeah.
Leadership
Oh,
mindset
huge.
change.
Well,
Because they are providing the 1,000 stories in
Totally.
the pipeline.
totally.
As she said, that like
Exactly.
upstream,
Yeah.
upstream if the leadership or making
So
the decision.
nobody
Bingo.
cares because they have dollars.